Hello, everybody. My name's Derek Arden, and welcome to Monday Night Live. At a very scary time, or a time where we need to be aware, I've invited my old friend Justin Urquart-Stewart, the BBC guru, the economist, the advisor, the columnist, and the author. Justin, it's great to see you, and I've got some tricky questions for you tonight, if that's okay.
Please do. Derek,
Number one, see you.
Great. And thank you for asking me back. And I wish it was under better circumstances, because the news, I'm afraid, isn't good. And I'm delighted by some of the comments your team have been saying in terms of actions we can be taking to actually show our support, and actually, in some ways, also trying to make sure we get the right messages through to the Russian people who are obviously not able to get it very easily.
Well, I've got 7 questions here. I'm going to fire them all at the same time, and then you can deal with them in whatever order that you want. Number 1's obviously Ukraine. Number 2 is interest rates. Number 3 is inflation. Number 4 is energy prices. Number 5 is Europe, then the States, and then the Far East. So I'll sit back and listen to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, look, obviously we have to focus on the key issue of the moment. Actually what's happening in Ukraine and the impact that's there, which is obviously absolutely horrific for those people. And so forgive me if I end up talking about things objectively. That's not to say in any shape or form that we're ignoring the personal and painful issues that are there. But we need to talk about some of the objective issues, such as commodity prices and all those issues. Now, of course, this is actually occurring at a time when last time we were talking about the world and post-pandemic world and how the global economy had been picking up, and we'd had figures generally for the global economy looking really quite encouraging. Figures in the States probably rolling over slightly, because everyone had been talking about the V-shaped recovery. But of course, they always get carried away with that. The result was you're going to get a short-term recovery, and then you get a longer-term one, but not as enthusiastic as people had previously thought. And that sort of looked what we was heading towards. That was the sort of encouraging issue. The American economy was in not bad shape. That always that very strange issue with regard to people not going back to work, which has been really quite astonishing. But that's been an interesting issue in Europe as well. But nonetheless, pretty positive. But of course, all of that has now just been shoved onto one side by what's happened in Ukraine. Now, of course, what was happening as a result of the pandemic was obviously not just the disruption to the economy itself, and then the recovery from it, and supply chain issues. And we saw various inflationary pressures building up as a result of that. And there was a question about 6 months ago, was the inflation just going to be a passing inflation? Oil goes up a lot, gas goes up a lot, but in 12 months' time, it drops off the calculation, and so therefore it's gone. Or was it now embedded? And that was the issue. And we certainly had some central bankers saying, oh, it only lasts a few months, it'll last a year, within a year, they're going to come off. That attitude has changed now, and quite rightly, because you only had to start looking at not just some of the basic inflation figures coming through, because some of the inflation figures are for industry. What you're actually seeing there, and I was seeing this with some of the manufacturing figures in the UK and certainly in Germany as well, are basic manufacturing figures of 10% inflation. That doesn't mean we end up paying 10%, but what it meant was you were seeing much more embedded inflation. And then you start seeing that going through to pay rises as well, and that's when life starts becoming a lot more difficult. And of course, we're dealing with the global economy, which hasn't really seen inflation for the majority of it for donkey's years. Okay, leave out the Looney Tunes of parts of South America, Venezuela and Argentina specifically, who seem to wallow in such matters. Though for the rest of us, actually, since the 1970s, we've really had pretty tame inflation. So people are really quite used to the idea of 2-3% inflation. So what if it gets a little bit higher and it drops off a bit? Well, Derek, despite the fact of the colour of his hair, will remember the fact in the 1970s that we did get inflation at one stage at 25% in the United Kingdom, looking possibly Brazilian in terms of interest rates. I'm talking about nothing else. And so, and that was dreadful when you saw people on fixed income seeing a 25% inflation on their income. And of course, those quite often people are pensioners, and they'll never see that back again. And so that's real poverty being created. So if we are going to be seeing significant inflation heading our way, this is going to be a very painful issue, not just a technical economic issue, but a very major social issue. And that social issue is going to be affecting not just the man in the street, whoever that particular person happens to be, but actually the weakest in society. Who are the weakest in society? Well, those with lowest earnings. Why are they being affected? Well, because the cost of commodities, and that was before we just started dealing with Ukraine, but cost of commodities being going up significantly. So things like pasta going up by 20 to 30%, and other really very, very basic food items going up a lot. And we could see that going up a great deal more. Then, of course, you've got energy costs going up a lot. And again, that was before Ukraine as well. So those the weakest in society will be finding out having particular problems, and particularly in the UK, where we have this thing known as the gas cap in the retail market, whereby the companies can't actually charge more than a certain level. That gets raised every so often, depending on what's happening in the market, and that's going to go up very dramatically in the next few months. So it's going to be very painful, again, for those weaker end of society. The other people involved in that, of course, will be pensioners. And of course, pensioners generally, not always, if they're on some form of income coming from a pension fund, from an insurance company, they may well find, if it's not index linked, and a lot of them aren't index linked these days, will find them on fixed levels and therefore be really affected again by that devaluation coming through by inflation. So this is going to be a major social issue occurring over the next year. Now add Ukraine into that, and you really now make this extremely painful indeed. And forgive me if I'm slightly overdoing it, because I just think it's incredibly important. Not just, obviously, we all know it, we all understand it, but we need to make sure politicians understand it, because it's going to cause some real pain indeed. And of course, there are no immediate answers to it. Ukraine, as I'm sure we all know, one of the major bread baskets of the world in terms of production of wheat, sunflower oil, and such like. As of course is Russia, as of course is Canada, as of course is America, all of whom have actually had rather poor harvests. Nothing to do with war, that was just due with changes in the climate. But of course, now, of course, with Ukraine, this is the time in Ukraine when apparently they should be putting the fertilizer down for the first crop coming through of wheat. If that's not happening, and that's generally in the southern area, then that's going to be incredibly difficult. And of course, the area where the Russians appear to be moving on now, Odessa, that Odessa is a small port, though, quite large port nearby, are the main export ports for the grain. And so there's a very good chance they're going to be blocked off. Not so much the port's blocked off, but you won't be able to get the grain, assuming you can actually harvest the grain in the first place. And again, this isn't just us saying, well, we're not going to get so much grain as before. You're talking about countries like Lebanon, Yemen, key countries in Africa, which depend upon getting that grain coming through. So this is going to be affecting third world issues as well, very dramatically. And so we may complain about our inflation coming through. For them, in terms of inflation and just sheer delivery of stuff, it's going to be very painful indeed. So we all watch the news, we'll see the same pictures. I'm not going to lecture everybody else on that. We all got our own views and opinions as to the horrific issues that are going on. So what can we actually do about it ourselves in terms of actually making sure that, and this may forgive me, it sounds rather selfish, I suppose, in terms of our own financial affairs and issues? Well, actually what you will be finding, and it was interesting today seeing what markets were doing. Markets dropped fairly dramatically today, not unsurprisingly, but actually towards the end of the day, it's actually started picking up again. And again, markets tend to get slightly self-satisfied and think that, well, it hasn't got any worse yet, so therefore things start picking up again. Markets like this need to be very careful. There'll be many false floors here, but you'll step on a tile, your foot will go straight through it, just as though you were in an Indiana Jones film, trying to walk across the dangerous floor. So be rather wary of all of this. Having said that, there are going to be times over the next few months where markets, in particular, whether it's commodities or certain sectors, are going to be particularly weak, and there will be assets there worth buying up. And this is not me just being selfish about it. Look, we've got to look after our own assets, make sure we've got some value there. And one of the areas good for that is quite likely to be the areas of the banks. Banks have been extremely unpopular, socially, as well in terms of business terms. But interest rates are very likely to be rising. We'll come back to interest rates a little bit later. And of course, banks like interest rates to be rising because interest rates at their current level, by close to zero, means that there's no differentiation between borrowing and lending. So there's no margin. So banks can't make it much money on that unless they're charging outrageous fees, which they're quite good at doing that too, but that's not the point. If, however, you see rates rising, that starts to give them a margin. That looks a little bit more encouraging. And some of these banks have been really pushed down very heavily indeed. Certainly some of the European banks And so maybe they're looking quite appealing at the moment. But investors at the moment have to be a brave investor going in for the time being. What may seem cheap in a dangerous market may seem quite expensive if things get considerably worse from now. But what we should be doing is not just putting our hands over our eyes, but looking for opportunities where things look out of whack. And it really does depend. If you think where the world is going to come to a horrendous end and Putin's going to be ruling the world, then there's not a great deal we can be doing. I think I suggested to you, actually, the best thing we can probably do with that, Derek, is buy a case of scotch and go and sit in a cave in Scotland. On the assumption that that's not going to happen, then actually we must be more practical about these things and find areas where will be more appealing to us. So inflation is going up, so generically, and it's going to be embedded. So what do you do with inflation? So normally with inflation, the normal thing you do is central banks put interest rates up, which of course they're desperate to try and do. Why are they desperate to try and do so? Well, for one main reason, if the economy starts slowing down again, they want to be able to cut interest rates. And it's quite difficult to cut interest rates if they're at naught, if they're up a little bit. The other thing, of course, is if you've got inflation going in there, then normally you would try and put interest rates up. But at the same time, put that up too much, and you've got your recovery, which is looking pretty weak anyway, as a result of this, then actually being stifled. So it's a very difficult balance here to what's going on. So is the recovery strong enough to be sustained in Europe and America, or will it actually just get squeezed out by this at the moment and just ending up, and we're going to end up with that thing known as the inflatable stagflation, stagnating economy with inflation. And that was very painful. We haven't seen that again since the 70s. And so we don't know whether that's going to be occurring or not, but it is one of those threats that's going to be there. So interest rates are likely to rise. And I think that does show a level of confidence by the central banks doing so, and confidence that the underlying economies, despite Ukraine and other issues, have been showing strength and as demand. Now, good news. Good news is that actually consumers have got money. Why? Well, one of the things when we were all stuck at home is you couldn't buy too much stuff. There's only so much stuff you could buy from Amazon. So after that, we couldn't go on holidays, couldn't go anywhere. And so we have money. And so the question is, will we have the confidence, again, that key word that runs an economy, to actually make us go out and spend it? Well, at the moment, probably not. So actually be in a position where we've got the money, but we just need to have the confidence to be able to do so. Now, the reason that's encouraging is, let's assume at some stage, heaven forfend that there's some answer to it, that there is a ceasefire or something happens, or maybe heaven forfend, there might even be a coup in Russia, but here's hoping that there is some light at the end of all of this. Then it means that we actually do have the financial wherewithal to actually then go and be spending our way out of this a bit more. And bear in mind, governments do have the ability to do so. They're heavily indebted. They're heavily indebted, of course, by quantitative easing money in terms of the developed economies, which is not wildly encouraging, but it does mean you do have access to fuel, although you may regard it as somewhat fake fuel. So it's a dreadful message, I'm afraid, that we've got, but one that we should actually be therefore saying, right, practically, look what we need to be doing. We need to be making sure we've got cash available to be able to use to pick up assets which are good value. Where are those assets going to be? Well, they're going to be assets which will be in demand. So it'll be things like commodities and those sort of areas. If you're that frightened, go and buy tin cans of things, but you don't have to go that far. We're more worried, actually, just go and buy some alcohol. Actually, I've probably done too much of that already. So those are elements of assets that you're going to be needing. But a lot of this is actually going to be outside our own controls. In terms of investing, it's going to be investing in those companies which have the ability to manage inflation. Who can manage inflation? Well, those that can pass on inflation. So quite often, actually, that's not always the utility companies, because a lot often it depends on your regulators. The regulators actually will actually stop that happening. Although I have to say, in Britain, we have fairly useless regulators, Ofsted or something, and they tend to get in the way from time to time, but don't really help. But beware of that. No, but things like other retailers, particularly food retailers and such like, will have the ability to pass that on. And it is frightening when you see actually how much they have been passing on, even though they try and talk about discounts and things like that. So for investors, therefore, look for those areas, which are ones which are being significantly underpriced because they're now out of fashion. So the ones like the banks and financial areas like that. And the financial ones will be attracting more interest as people want to put money aside. And then also those companies where they can pass that on, say some of the retail companies, particularly the food ones, to be able to do so. Government debt and things like that, I'm afraid, is going to be extremely unpopular at the moment, hardly surprising, and not going to give you much benefit from inflation. Inflation bonds are always going to be something that people can always try and have, but a lot of that has already gone in. The price is in those inflation bonds already. But nonetheless, if you want to lock into that, you think inflation is going higher, you can use those. And apart from that, you're then buying other assets which will be going up in value. They may not be tradable, but actually lumps of things which you'll be able to use and go up. Does that mean gold? Yeah, could be gold. But bear in mind, with those assets, any of those other lumps of things, there is no compounding, there's no income. And remember, the greatest gain investors have is from compounding over time. Merely just by buying an asset and hope it's going to go up, well done. But frankly, that's a form of betting in my view. No, so it's maybe a form of investing, but for long-term investors, it's that compounding over time, which is your background drumbeat for returns. So if you can get your dividends coming through. So who's paying dividends? Well, we've had obviously those retailers I was talking about, but of course, obviously the commodity companies themselves. Oil companies, the miners, of course, the miners have done very well over the past few months, a few weeks, and you can see obviously why. So their margin is going to be pretty significant, particularly, of course, as some of their Russian competitions being knocked off the stock market and actually been sent packing. And they have been seeing dividends being paid, rising dividends being paid. So for those investors, that's encouraging. Even at these levels, if you're getting that sort of yield coming through, obviously it depends which companies, but have a look at the yields, that's still going to be a positive return for you. So despite the horrific news and those dreadful pictures, I think we have to take a step back and say, no, yes, we will do everything we can responsibly to try and help society, and particularly help those who are going to be in pain in our own society, the weaker ones, the older ones, but also look after ourselves as well, to actually make sure that our finances are all right. And there are things we can do there to make sure we're protected and we don't just sit there and look in utter horror at these dreadful pictures and do nothing at all. Take action on it and share stories with other people. What's going up, what's going down, what's winning. Look at those longer term assets, which will be in greater demand. And if you can get the ones which are giving you a return as well good on you.
Fantastic. What about, how do we resolve this negotiation issue with a guy who's backing himself into a corner? And needs to be let out of that corner, I guess, with his finger on a certain button. Do we have to bring in countries like China? How does America deal with this on our behalf?
It's a fascinating one, isn't it? Because you've got an interesting combination of factors here. You've got India, of course. India, of course, the tradition has been allied to Russia. A lot of their arms come from there. And you have a lot of Indian students over there. It's been interesting, actually, some of the concern Indian students have had actually in Ukraine and how they've been treated. And of course, then India and China, of course, they have their border disputes there as well. And of course, China and Russia themselves haven't always been best buddies for many years as well. Now, to today, my enemy's enemy is my friend sort of thing. So are they getting together? People have been saying, well, of course, China's got something similar with Taiwan. Taiwan is not similar. Taiwan is very different indeed. And the Chinese are much more pragmatic. By the way, let's also remember, before we get too carried away, Russia's big. Russia is a dangerous power. It is not a superpower. It's got a lot of arms, run by a loony, but actually, remember, its economy is slightly more than 50% of the entire UK economy. Now, the UK is tiny. So, but you think about the size of Russia, it's actually not worth a great deal. Its economy is in a terrible shape. And as a result of these sanctions, and more practical sanctions, the ones I was pressing for last week was not SWIFT, because they got the message wrong. SWIFT is the transmission. It's not the money payment system. Actually, you go to something we used to have to deal with, didn't we, in Barclays, having to do with correspondent banking. You freeze the correspondent banking currency account. That's where you stop it all. And you don't need many of those actually to freeze. That grinds it to a halt pretty bloody quickly. Anyway, they are now doing that, which is good. It also means that Putin can't get his hands on his 600 billion, which he's got in cash stuffed away. But if it's stuffed away in a foreign bank account, can't get at it. MasterCard and Visa stop their system as well. Things dry up pretty quickly. And so you start trying to run a war. And remember, in Britain, we get upset when someone fires one missile off because it costs £250,000. We get terribly upset about it all. Good God, we've got a country which is worth half that of Britain firing off thousands of missiles. They can't afford it. So he can't afford to keep this going. That doesn't mean he actually has to sit there and run a little cash account for it. No, because of course he can keep it going just to be bloody minded about the thing. But no, he can't afford to keep it going, but doesn't mean he can't cause an awful lot of pain in the meantime. So to go back to your question about China, China is the issue to it, because China, of course, is quite willing to take the gas, would like to take the gas as well, but of course it doesn't actually necessarily find itself having to. The deal that Germany did actually found ourselves in a position which was, no, we were obliged to, but we've gone back on that. And I find it is actually quite astonishing when you think about it, how much a German government has changed of the wrong color, including the Greens, actually gone back and said, actually, we might have nuclear power, we might bring back coal power, and we're going to stop Nord Stream 2, and we're going to renege on some of the deals, potentially renege. That happened in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, no, and of course increase their defence spending by an astonishing amount. No, the way that actually that Germany hasn't done for donkey's years. One of the things, of course, actually Mr. Trump was right about. It wasn't Mr. Trump who was first going on about it all, though. So let me go back to that point of China. China is the one that probably has enough strength over Russia to be able to actually say thus far and no further. That's if you're dealing with someone who is logical and is willing to actually have a discussion, not someone who appears to have a big inferiority complex and requires a 30-yard table between him and the next person he's talking to, unless it's half a dozen air hostesses, but we'll leave that alone, which I suspect he probably didn't. So the point there is that well, I would like to think that China has more control, but we just don't know. Remember, President Xi isn't exactly well known for his democratic views. President Xi is very keen on actually turning his name to Mao if he possibly could. But again, they're much more pragmatic. They're not ones who actually wish to be invading Taiwan immediately. They would be they'd be more pragmatic to be rattling around sabers and getting Taiwan to come to them in due course, despite necessarily what some of the media like to tell us. So that's slightly more encouraging, but that at the moment is merely a wish on all our parts, rather than necessarily any evidence we've got to show for it.
So we got one or two friends on from the Baltic states here, and they must be a bit worried about NATO and backing them, which must worry everybody. I see President Macron was on the phone to Putin for 2 hours. Was he really?
Well, what he was trying to say was actually, could you actually open up some of those escape routes again? But that's lovely, having an escape route. I'll give you an escape route, going to Russia. Oh, brilliant, lovely, or Belarus. It's hardly an escape route. That's sort of going the wrong way. But no, thank heaven the Baltic states have come under the wing of NATO. NATO, and I'm pleased that Stoltenberg has said very clearly, it is a defensive issue, and 1 foot stepped onto a member of NATO is an offence to us all, and we will all take action against it. So, which is great. So the Baltic states should take comfort for that. I hope that we all have. And I have to say, if there's one thing that this horoscope has done, it's actually managed to pull together NATO, German defense spending, and the integration of our defense packages far more effectively than ever our own ministers or leaders have ever been able to do. That's small mercy for it, but for those in the Baltic states, take some comfort, please. But on the other hand, when you're dealing with a nation like Russia and you see their behavior, they've reverted to form. You saw the failure of the attack on Ukraine. They tried to do a rather poor man's blitzkrieg, only to find, of course, actually that the road wasn't wide enough and got stuck in the mud either side. I mean, do me a favor, you couldn't make it up. And then reverting to form. What's form? You blow the place apart. That's what they did in Grozny. So they did in Aleppo. And so, and that's what we're seeing here. And this is just disgusting, as we all know.
A couple of questions in the chat box. From Alex, how do you think the sanctions against Russian businesses, banks and the oligarchs will play out in Russia?
Well, it's going to be interesting, I think, because it's, it's not as though it's an open market. So no one's actually going to know, because oligarchs over there don't exactly advertise themselves as saying, see the size of my yacht, and know how much I'm actually worth. Well, are they going to be unpopular over there? Well, they would be unpopular if anybody actually knew how much they actually had. The trouble is, unfortunately, the average Russian citizen hasn't got a bloody clue what's going on, particularly, of course, now that the rest of the independent media has been shut down, and all they can get is from the alternative media. Now, I don't know how much of that they're going to have access to. But as we were saying before, maybe we can all help with that by attaching messages to Russian corporates as to actually what's going on. But even so, bear in mind, when you're dealing with a country which has been so used to having state media feeding it the entire time, that's what they take to be true. And it takes a long time to people turn around and say and question it. What happened with Afghanistan? It took over a year, and the body bags were coming back, and the troops were coming back, and the injured were coming back, and people saying it's not as per the news. And so that, how much of that is fed back? The only encouraging sign is the fact you are seeing brave people demonstrating, not just in Moscow, but even out in Vladivostok. And that is encouraging. You have to be bloody brave to go and do that. I wish to think I had the bravery to do it. I'm not too sure I have. I need a big drink beforehand.
Do you think those pictures are real, though? I did wonder about that. People demonstrating in Moscow, or whether they were fake pictures from other times.
We don't know, do we? All you can do is probably just try and hope someone picks up the issues of the fashion figures, maybe some of the adverts and all those sort of things to actually tell us whether they're right or not. So one would just like to think so. One hopes that there's, when you hear from the BBC that they say they've had it validated, well, I can only take that as being hopefully slightly more encouraging.
Well, Ida's in Estonia, and she said her mum's out there, and the price of bread has doubled in the last few weeks.
I mean, I was looking at something as exciting over here as the price of a very, very basic dried pasta. And that had gone up by 40%. Okay, it was discounted, and now it's gone up to another price. And that, of course, the dried pasta will be going to the little old lady who's trying to eke out what's going on. And there was a program I was on the other day, one of the new news channels in Britain, business news channels, and interviewing there with a lady there who was one of their viewers. And it was absolutely devastating, her situation. She'd done everything she could in terms of making sure she had enough pension money and things like that. But of course, she hasn't enough pension money because it's been eroded away. And when asked by the presenter, he said, well, what do you think of the Chancellor giving you a £150 loan? She said, loan? How can I pay it back? This doesn't help. Makes for good headlines, but really doesn't help the underlying issue. No, we've got to use some more social imagination here, and to be doing it locally, to have those who can afford to help those who can't afford in regions, in towns, something I'm afraid we haven't been very good at in the past, but maybe we could try and help and start again.
I guess the UK government's caught up in all sorts of things with the oligarchs, but we won't want to talk about that now. But
well, those who are in the House of Lords, that is.
Godfrey asks, will the UK law firms and accountants, who are obviously been making a fortune out of these people, will they be censored by the government?
Yeah, watch them very carefully to see who does pull out. It's very interesting to see who is and who isn't. You see PwC and one other was actually saying that they were pulling out, but the specialist law firms and things like that have been making a lot of money out of this. But of course, they necessarily won't be making money. They can shut their office in Russia, in Moscow. They can still give advice over here. And so we'll never know is the answer. So I suspect the benefit to them has been far too good. But they ought to be very careful indeed, because it'll start seeping out if certain firms are seen to be actually making money out of this. This worm has turned at last. It's taken years to do so. When we've all sat there saying, look, we know that London Grad has been there, that these wretched properties have been going up in price, and we've known what's been going on, and we've been money laundering, and of course happily accepting it. I remember Osborne going on about it on the basis that actually we encourage people to come and invest in here. Well, yes, do so, but not with stolen money. And of course we didn't want to check. Don't check. Therefore, I don't know. I just sold it. Haven't looked. But of course we have to. I'm afraid we do have is it blood on our hands? That's probably too dramatic, but we certainly have levels of guilt against the lack of control and honesty we had in our system. London was a money laundering centre.
That's only really just coming out now, isn't it, into the real press? A bit like Abramovich has got a £100 million house in Kensington. I can't believe how there's a £100 million house in Kensington. And of course, his ownership of Chelsea Football Club is somewhere in the Cayman Islands. So the whole thing's pretty complicated. presumably being managed by the best accountants and lawyers in the UK at the moment.
Well, and what's the issue about actually when you go after the money? Well, one of the issues is how long before you can actually then actually close the house down or the account down or whatever. They were talking about, well, give them a couple of years, give them 6 months. Actually, Labour Party was saying make it 28 days. so they actually can't get the money out and just stop it unless they can prove it's there. Then after that, fine, take it away. And I think, frankly, the tighter we should be with it. Are you going to put off people coming to Britain? So what? We don't want dirty money here anyway.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, isn't it? We're nearly coming to the end of the official part of the programme, Justin, but tell us about regionally. I saw that your investment in regionally, I think you're the chairman and the chief executive. You've won some awards last year, which was really going well, but I guess things are a bit on hold at the moment.
No, I'm one of the co-founders. Much more people doing far more work than I am. But the idea is to try and actually just build infrastructure rather than anything else, to put back the ability to invest in the regions, because a lot of investment in Britain had been focused much more on London. The AIM market for smaller companies was originally started by a group of 6 of us in Glasgow years ago. It was only brought down to London when London decided to close the Glasgow Stock Exchange, which was a bit tiresome. And since then, AIM, I'm afraid, has been a bit of a pain and has been expensive and not very efficient. What I want to do is actually not have local stock exchanges again, but have regional investment hubs, because there's no shortage of money. And we've got lots of businesses in this country, lots of startups, but a lot of growth businesses, but the growth capital isn't being fed through to them. There's private equity and venture capital. That's 3 years. It's too short term. You need 5-7 year investment capital. So the answer is it's operating, and it's operating slowly. Nothing's going to be taking off very excitedly about that for the time being. And frankly, we've got more important things to be getting on with. But it allows us to get the infrastructure in place. And when things get better, then hopefully more money will flow through to those growth businesses.
And do you think windfall taxes might work to help the low income, or are we taxed out at the moment?
Well, who are we actually going to be doing windfall taxes on? You can say the commodity companies and the power companies and things like that. But on the other hand, you also want them paying dividends, so you can actually get your dividends coming out for your compounding. Those people that can be seen to have actually just made windfall tax because I've made a lot of money because the price went up, I didn't do anything for it. There's justification there, but unfair penalisation of it really doesn't actually set a very good precedent for it. So the answer is there's a balance here between, look, you made X% of profit just because you did nothing, the price went up, as opposed to actually you be making more money out of this because the market has actually grown. But at the same time, we need these companies to be strong. So there's a careful balance. Smacking companies just because they're making money doesn't always actually help you. It makes good for good headlines, but doesn't always necessarily help. But there are examples where people have just been in the right place at the right time, and therefore, if they're paying themselves huge amounts of money for doing so, then there's every reason for to go after them. If they're going to be sharing that out, then that's okay. I have a better view towards it.
And cyber currencies, Bitcoin?
Well, you see, that's going to be one of the issues now. People will be looking for alternative assets, won't they? And they look for alternative assets. What's happening in currencies? At times like this, everyone runs to the dollar. Hardly surprising. But if you're concerned about dollar debt and those sort of issues, well, I will go to a cyber currency. Good. Based on what? Absolutely sod all square. Bear in mind, these things are expensive to run. They're not regulated. And so therefore, what are you investing in? They may go up, well done if they do, but there is no real logic behind actually saying that these are actually going to be decent assets you should be holding. If you actually have in some form of regulation and you can tie them to some form of asset management, then you're actually going to have some, or asset value, then you have some better idea of what you're dealing with. For the moment, you're just dealing with something that's punty. When you deal with something like El Salvador, good God, they were going to try and make it their primary currency. Well, given that the primary currency in El Salvador was the colon, which I assume wasn't the human one, and it's even slightly more worrying. Actually, most of the time, actually in El Salvador, they have to use the US dollar. But no, that was just utter madness. So it'll sound attractive, and I'm sure some of them will go up in value. That's betting. And frankly, if you're going to go betting, might as well go on a horse race. You should have a decent drink at the same time.
But some of the asset management companies are investing in cyber currencies, aren't they? They have to, don't they, now, to have a balanced portfolio?
Well, no, I'm not too sure they necessarily have to. But I mean, yes, certainly it's now being seen as an asset class. I'm afraid I would disagree. It's an asset class. It's just I don't think it's a particularly acceptable asset class. For an asset class, I want something which is measurable, understandable, and be able to have some level of control. And you have absolutely no control over these things at all. So I'm afraid, it is those people who are just wishing to, I think, probably join a fashion fad and said, and we've got Bitcoin in here as well. Well done. I'm afraid that doesn't impress me at all. Look, good investing, actually, in days like this, should be really quite dull. Number one, don't lose the sodding stuff. Rule two, don't lose the sodding stuff. Refer to rule one. Grow it steadily over time, compounded over time. If you get one or two other wins on the way, that's good. But just don't lose the sodding stuff.
I think that's the best advice you can give anybody, because we all know people who like a punt on things and go for it, and they hear that everything's marvelous and it's all going up and never goes down. And at the end of the day, it's about your capital, isn't it? It is about. It is,
and very few people will actually admit to the times they got it wrong. And will they get it wrong? Every asset manager will have times when they get it wrong. Of course they do. That's why you have to have a blend of the assets. The whole point is you can have something which is steadily burbling along over time. Dull, that actually can be quite good, so long as dull is making sure it's ahead of the costs and ahead of inflation. And of course, that's going to be one of the problems at the moment. The costs may be going up, and inflation is certainly going up. But mind you, with investment these days, the cost of investment, good investment, with things like ETFs and those sorts of things, has come down dramatically. And the fact that now more investment managers have to be, dare I say, even honest, well, that's going a bit far, a little bit more open in terms of their charges. Some of them still have a nasty habit of, what's the technical term? Lying. And some of the big investment houses, I have to say, there's one big retail investment house in London, which I think is just disgusting in the way it charges. So be wary. I'm afraid there are still vagabonds around.
Last question. What's going to happen to property prices over this?
Which ones? It's interesting to know, isn't it? Because funny enough, in Britain at the moment, we're dealing with actually property price rises going up quite dramatically, and particularly actually a shortage of leased property. There just isn't sufficient volume of property around. But of course, this will eventually have an impact when people are just saying, well, is it starting to impact on jobs, on incomes, and so therefore they can't afford too much. So be wary. And it varies very much where you are. Central London prices have already come off quite a bit, the very top end. But elsewhere, actually, you've seen really some quite surprising numbers, which have surprised me. Is that going to continue? I'm not too sure it will. I think we've seen a bit of a false market over the past year or so.
Justin, we're so grateful for you joining us yet again. I hope you'll come back and talk to us in 3 months' time. Stay on for a few questions if you can, unless the BBC or the German television want you. But on behalf of everybody, can I thank Justin for sharing his knowledge with us in the usual way. Thank you so much, Justin Urquart-Stewart. And
thank you very much. Thank you, Derek.
Absolute pleasure. And if you're watching this on YouTube or listening to this on the Negotiators podcast and you want to get in touch with Justin or get in touch with me, just join us on LinkedIn or send us an email message. Thanks for watching.